This is the second of two videos on the discipline of history and how it developed over time, the field of historiography. Looking at American historiography, several debates have stood out within these larger schools of thought. Historians have debated for years at what point America began to develop a market-based capitalist society from a land-based mercantilist and plantation economy. They have debated whether economic or ideological factors played a greater role in the American Revolution. They've argued, as evidenced by Charles Beard, whether the Constitution was a step toward more or less freedom and democracy. Historians have debated the causes of the Civil War and the nature of slavery. To what extent was slavery paternalistic or harsh? They've argued over the success of the post-Civil War Reconstruction and have debated whether reform movements of the progressive era 100 years ago were forward-looking or nostalgic. They've argued over the causes and ramifications of the Second World War and the Cold War. All of this is just to cite a few, however, for there are as many debates as there are topics in history. Historiography is the realm of graduate-level history. Here at Southeastern, students will learn almost no historiography. They should at least understand what the debate, the general idea of debate is, and that debate is a lifeblood of the discipline of history. This acknowledged, students should be aware of the arguments of several leading writers in history that have had a profound effect, not only on the discipline itself, but on larger society. Writing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, for example, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel argued that in history new ideas periodically rose to challenge dominant assumptions. This is what Hegel referred to as the dialectic. Out of this dialectic emerged a third, new idea, a synthesis of the old and new. This synthesis would become the new status quo until a still newer idea emerged and the dialectic repeated itself. This, Hegel argued, explained history. The writer Karl Marx took Hegel's dialectic and applied it to economics. Throughout history, Marx wrote, a powerful elite controlled the means of production and thus dominated society. When a new means of production emerged, however, there was a conflict between the old order and the advocates of the new. Because the new was a synthesis, it won out in the end and created another dominant elite. This process has guided history. In feudalism, for example, land ownership was key to the means of production, and thus the lords dominated society. During the Renaissance, however, capitalism, money, began to replace land ownership as the key to production. Moneyed capitalists were the new powerful elite. Marx then projected into the future, suggesting that all the money would consolidate in the hands of too few. The moneyless masses would then rebel with the idea of a collective ownership of the means of production, not private property. For this reason, Marx is often called the father of communisms. Hegel's dialectic influenced far more than just Marx. Another historian that played off Hegel's dialectic was Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee wrote in the early and mid-20th century and spent years writing an incredible 12-volume history of the world. All civilizations, Toynbee concluded, have some form of crisis, face some form of crisis, whether it was a new technology or a new idea that emerged to challenge the status quo. The civilization's survival depended on how well it reacted to this crisis. Toynbee's examples suggest that science has often served as the engine of challenge, and those civilizations that embraced it have performed the best. Occasionally, those who have not embraced it have stuck with such things as theological belief. They haven't performed quite as well. The writer Charles Darwin has, of course, profoundly affected people's view of history. Writing in the mid-19th century, Darwin outlined the basics of physical evolution, first in his Origin of Species, and then, more controversially, in his Descent of Man. Darwin's theory of natural selection is beyond the scope of this short lesson, but its implied principle of survival of the fittest has had a profound impact on social and economic policy over the years. Today, modern science accepts Darwin's theories, and they form the basis for modern biology and other biologically based sciences, even as their historical impact remains a central subject in history and the humanities. In regard to American history specifically, one final historian's thesis stands out. Writing in the early 20th century, Frederick Jackson Turner proposed what became known as the Frontier Thesis. Turner argued that the existence of a wild, unconquered frontier in the American West made the United States and its people what they became. It made prosperity and democracy possible. The Western frontier contributed in three ways. First, it offered a seemingly endless supply of valuable raw materials. Second, it created a self-reliance in the people who immigrated there. In the frontier, they had to solve problems themselves or they would perish. This made them hardworking with a can-do attitude, both key ingredients for prosperity. Finally, many of the people who went to the Western frontier had nothing else to live far back east. They were often young, poor men who might have otherwise turned to crime or instigated a rebellion. With the frontier, there was always another chance, and thus the frontier acted as a siphon for discontented elements back east. This made American governance and democracy. All of these ideas and theories have influenced generations of historians. There are many more, of course, but that will have to wait for the student's graduate education. In closing, it should be noted that one last group of writers tend to dismiss history in its entirety. Known as radical historians, they argue that all history is written by the winner. Removing biases is impossible. The agenda is always present, and the losers in society will never have the true story told. There's no point to it. Anyway, this concludes the 2 videos on the discipline of history and historiography.